Agreement between Washington and Tehran has all but ended the Iran war, with all sides claiming victory despite the huge cost. Among that has been damage to Iranian relationship with its Gulf neighbours, which it attacked. So what has Iran won and lost in the region from this war? This is Inside Story. Hey there, I'm Scott McLean. All-out war between Iran, the U.S., and Israel would have been unimaginable just 2 years ago. The reality has had global consequences, but that impact's been most severe on Iran itself and the Gulf region. Agreement to end the war brings some relief, but also assessment of the consequences of this conflict. Iran says it's emerged stronger, but it's also left with the consequences of a devastating U.S.-Israeli bombardment. Also in need of repair are relationships with Gulf states, which came under Iranian attack, something also scarcely believable just 2 years ago. So what have been Iran's losses and gains? We'll try to find out from our guest shortly, but first, this report from Nargis Mobalaghi.
Iran and the United States have reached an initial agreement to end the war, which began at the end of February. The Memorandum of Understanding paves the way for detailed negotiations and the hope of a long-term settlement to a conflict that has caused tectonic shifts in the region.
Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take.
The US goal at the start of the war was a change in government and unconditional surrender. That never happened. Perhaps Iran's most crucial success of this war is that it has survived, and it hit back hard. Its Gulf neighbours, however, bore the brunt. Iran retaliated by striking 9 countries across the GCC and beyond. Tehran said it was targeting US bases and assets. Gulf countries said civilian facilities were also hit. Those attacks have put unprecedented pressure on relations between Iran and the GCC, further strained by the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. The diplomatic damage will have to be weighed up in any post-war assessment. The GCC spoke with one voice condemning the attacks by Iran, but the US decision to attack Iran without consulting its Gulf allies has led to significant diplomatic reassessments. Israel, however, has continued attacking Lebanon, which has become a central element of the war with Iran and in difficulties between Donald Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Defying Trump, Israel attacked southern Beirut while negotiations with Iran were at a highly delicate stage. Iran followed through on warnings, hitting Israel in retaliation. Iran's foreign minister continues to maintain that Israel must leave Lebanese territory.
The end of the war in Lebanon is an inseparable part of the complete end of the war, and the end of the war includes the end of the occupation as well.
Iran is weighing up the deterrence it has managed to establish and the damage that has been caused. It retains significant military capacity, according to Western intelligence assessments, with large stockpiles of missiles underground. But it has been heavily hit, and the country's economic situation, which was already dire before the war, has worsened. Many Iranians, faced with unprecedented inflation, are struggling to put food on the table. The war has seen pain on all sides. Iran's leverage, in part gained by attacking its neighbours, has upended many certainties in the Gulf. How relations between Iran and neighbouring states develop after the war will be crucial to the geopolitical stability of a region of huge global importance. Nargis Mobalaghi, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests in Tehran. Akbar Dareini, researcher at the Center for Strategic Studies in Saint-Tropez, France. Roxane Farmanfarmaian, professor of modern Middle East politics at the University of Cambridge. And here in Doha, Mehran Kamrava, professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. and head of the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Thank you all so much for being here. Obviously, we are interested today in tallying up the gains and the losses for Iran in this war. But Professor Farmanfarmaian, I want to start with you. If we can just take the broad view here. Is Iran stronger or weaker today than it was before this conflict started?
Well, I think one can discuss many different angles, but I think there are a couple of things that are worth pointing out. One is that the fact that its population has rallied around the flag in the face of a conflict means that the government itself is feeling somewhat more secure and less vulnerable than it was both at the time of the June war, but particularly during the protests that were taking place in January. So I think that's been a definite positive for the government. And I think likewise, the clarity that it's been able to establish in its control over the Hormuz Strait has given it a card that simply was not part of its deck prior to the war. And it's realizing this is really a critical card, and it intends to play it in the future. And it's one that has obviously pushed Trump to take all the other elements really off the table for this deal. And its focus has been to open up the Hormuz Strait. So this has given it an extra push, I think.
And I certainly want to ask all three of you more on that. But Ali, you're there in Tehran. Was the goal of this conflict for the Iranian government just survival? And if that's the case, can we put this one in the win column?
Survival is the biggest achievement, but Iran's achievements are not limited to surviving this war of aggression by two nuclear powers, and one of them the world's biggest military and economic power. Iran exposed the limits of U.S. power. Before that, the Americans were telling everybody that their policy is to negotiate with bombs. If they increase bombings, the other party will surrender. That didn't work with Iran. This war exposed the limits of U.S. power. It shattered the U.S. stature in the eyes of the world. It destroyed U.S. credibility in the eyes of even its Arab allies. The Americans could not even protect their own military assets, let alone their Arab allies. Everybody understood that American military bases are to protect Israel, not the Arabs. But also this war showed to everybody how Iranians rallied around the national flag. Iran demonstrated national solidarity and demonstrated the core of Iran's strategic culture, that is not giving in to foreign bullying and aggression. You can set no value to those Iranians who wrote from inside the jail saying they are ready to sacrifice their blood in defense of the country against U.S. and Israeli war of aggression. So there is a lot of achievements for Iran. And finally, I can add that the very fact that the United States was forced to agree to this memorandum of understanding is a clear sign that the Americans failed. They hoped they can finish off Iran in 72 hours, control Iran's oil, destroy Iran's navy, military, as well as missiles and the nuclear infrastructure, and control Iran. They failed. This is a strategic failure for the United States and a strategic victory for Iran.
Professor Kamrava, Ali there says that this war has exposed the limits of American military might. Do you agree?
Well, yes and no. Never historically has a great power attacked a weaker state and has been able to declare victory, whether it was the Americans in Vietnam, or the Soviets in Afghanistan, or the Americans in Iraq, or the Russians in Ukraine. But I don't think Vietnam or Afghanistan or Ukraine could declare victory. What happens in the process is that the greater power inflicts significant economic and infrastructural damage. And I think it would be hard to deny that Iran has suffered greatly as a result of this war. But in the process, Iran has managed to give both the United States and Israel a bloody nose. And it has managed to demonstrate that it has multiple sources of leverage in the Strait of Hormuz, across the Persian Gulf, throughout by hitting American bases. So I'm not sure if we can say Iran is either weaker or stronger. I think we have to have a much more nuanced conception of the multiple consequences of this conflict.
Professor Farmanfarmaian, ostensibly this war was launched to prevent Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon. But also, before and at points during this war, the rationale at times was also to bring what the Americans or the Israelis would call regime change to Iran and ostensibly bring some version of democracy or at least a better government than the one that they have right now. Is any hope for democracy in Iran, has that been lost through this conflict?
Well, I'm not sure I would accept that the process in Iran is entirely not democratic. I think that it's very interesting. If you look at the leadership that is running the country at the moment, it represents representatives of various different institutions. So you have Ghalibaf, who is the Speaker of the Parliament. He was elected. You have Pezeshkian and Araghchi, who were elected, part of the Reformist Party of Iran. You have, of course, a new supreme leader, but nonetheless, the supreme leader is a representative of the clerical strength and institutions. So there are combinations now of people in power working together, which represent quite an interesting example of democratic decision making. And I think it's going to be tricky for them to turn the gains they've made now under military conflict into political and economic gains. Now, hopefully that there might be some breathing space ahead. But I think what we're seeing is that it is a government that is composed of different aspects of Iranian society. And so that's very much representative of what people in Iran would like to see, perhaps slightly adjusted over time, a more economically viable one, but it is not a dictatorship or an autocracy that is anywhere near, for example, some of the monarchies and emirates that we see in the Gulf.
But I think if you asked, the American government, the Israeli government, I think when they say democracy, they mean something more akin to a Western democracy, and they would point at the Iranian government and say, look, governments that kill their own people during protests en masse are not akin to Western governments. Are you saying they already have a democracy in place that's sort of comparable in any way?
I would say that the people of Iran have made it very clear that they would like to have a full say as to who is going to be their leadership. And the view that's being taken in Washington or in Tel Aviv does not have anything to do with what they would like to have for their own government. So I think we saw that the statements by Trump and by Netanyahu at the beginning of this war and during the protests to say that they were going to come in and help and they were right there with the Iranian people proved to be completely wrong. They were not there and they were not helping. And in fact, nowhere in the Iranian uprisings or demonstrations that we've seen have they ever called on the United States or Israel to define their new government or their democratic process. And I don't think that they really believe that Washington or Tel Aviv or Jerusalem have a good idea of what their national interest is. More, they would be promoting the American and the Israeli national interests.
Professor Kamrava, I want to ask you about the Strait of Hormuz because the U.S. president says that it's going to be open indefinitely with no tolls on it. But I wonder if Iran maybe has gained something of a trump card with their ability to shut it down at will.
Absolutely. And it's a source of leverage that Iran has come to. We've been talking throughout this program about, we started by talking about Donald Trump's desire to bring about regime change. So he started the war wanting regime change in Iran, and now he's ending it wanting the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, which was opened before the war. So the Iranians have discovered a tremendous source of leverage. And I think it's important to keep in mind that they don't necessarily need to close it in order to impede traffic through it. The Mosquito fleet that the Iranian Navy has can easily harass shipping up and down the Strait of Hormuz or throughout the Persian Gulf. And I think, we need to take into account in the reluctance of insurance companies to underwrite vessels going through the Gulf. I think we need to remember that there's tremendous vulnerability. We're looking at an extremely narrow strait and a very shallow waterway. And so for Iran, this has been a tremendous source of leverage. And I think moving forward, the Iranians would be reluctant to completely relinquish some sort of coordinating role over the Strait of Hormuz.
President Trump is at the G7 this week in France, and he was sitting with the Qatari emir when he was asked about U.S.-Israel relations, and this is what he said. Listen.
Without us, without the United States, there would be no Israel. Without me, there would be no Israel, because no other president was willing to do what I did. I've had a great relationship with Bibi, but now Bibi has to be more responsible with respect to Lebanon.
So, Ali, have the Iranians succeeded in forcing the U.S.'s hand and maybe tightening the leash on Israel, or have they just exposed the fact that Israel doesn't take directions from anybody?
The Americans and Israelis have been always in strategic agreement. They are not separable. That's why Iran looks at both as one entity. That's why Iran's strategy is, if Israel attacks Lebanon, Iran will attack Israel directly. But if Israel attacks Iran, Iran will retaliate both against Israel and the United States. Israel cannot fight for 5 days without U.S. involvement and direct military and political support. So the two are not separate from each other. But right now, there is a temporary rift or strain in relations between Trump and Netanyahu. Netanyahu is a spoiler who doesn't want any deal. Trump needs a deal badly because why? Because Iran has successfully tied the war to U.S. economy. I bet Trump is very nervous about inflation and midterm elections. And if the war continued or expanded, very likely Republicans would risk losing midterm elections, and inflation would be high with oil prices going up $120 per barrel. So Iran doesn't count on Israeli-U.S. differences. Iran looks at both of them as one entity, and at the end of the day, Iran may see that as a good cop, bad cop, a game played by Israel and Trump. But the serious thing is, this memorandum of understanding will put both Trump and Netanyahu to an immediate test. If the Americans can can control Israel and comply with their obligations, Iran will go to the second phase of the talks, of the process. Otherwise, they're going to kill it. That's one of the strategic achievements for Iran, is to arrange this two-phase arrangement. Iran had a bitter history with the Americans. Americans reneged on their promises in the past. So Iran said there has to be two stages. First, confidence-building measures to make sure that the Americans will comply with their obligations. If Iran verifies and Iran is satisfied, then Iran will start talking to the Americans and will go to the second round.
Professor Kamrava, all three of you have illustrated that there have been some gains for Iran throughout the course of the war. But I wonder if those gains really outweigh the economic damage and the physical damage that has been done to the Iranian economy, Professor.
I think the jury is still out on that. But a couple of things very quickly to keep in mind. First and foremost, the Islamic Republic has shown a tendency to overplay its hands. And I think moving forward over the next several weeks and months, we have to wait and see whether or not the gains that Iran has made strategically, militarily, will last, or whether Iran will overuse and overplay its hands. Secondly, I think now is the time for post-war reconstruction. And the Iranian population is going to demand from the policymakers tangible results. Enough of this useless ideological pursuits, the corruption that's rampant within the political system, rent-seeking behavior that is at all layers of the state. And I think we'll have to wait and see whether or not the policymakers in Tehran can deliver on the actual needs that the population demands.
Professor Farmanfarmaian, President Trump said at the G7 that at the outset of the war, he expected Iran to fire at Israel. What he did not expect is Iran to fire at its Gulf neighbors. Do you think that the damage in Iran-Gulf relations have been damaged beyond repair, or do you think that the fact that the Gulf countries have been so involved in diplomacy shows that there is a future relationship there?
Well, I think, first of all, they're all in the same territory. They're neighbors, and no one is going to go anywhere. They are their most close relations in terms of their territory. So I think there was already an understanding before this last round of negotiations that members of the Gulf Cooperation Council would be involved in trying to bring an end to this, even though, as your report indicated, they had not been consulted about the war going in. And it's been really clear that Qatar in particular, but also Saudi Arabia and from the north, that Turkey have added significant input to trying to find a way forward and an agreement here. And I think although there's going to be a new alignment, I don't think there's any question about that. Part of that realignment is also that it's going to be very difficult for the United States to rebuild its bases there, reinvest. And so I think the Gulf states themselves are reassessing the role of the U.S. in the Gulf. And that has, of course, been one of Iran's primary desires, is to see the United States leave the Gulf and leave the Middle East entirely. So there may be quite a bit of common ground there. And the fact that they are constantly in touch with the foreign minister, Araghchi, who has mentioned many, many times how many conversations he's had with his colleagues in the Gulf, I think there's a very good chance that new relationships, but nonetheless positive ones, will come out of this.
Professor Kamrava, has the usefulness of these U.S. bases in Gulf countries been called into question throughout the course of this war? And do you think that President Trump, were he to abandon some of those bases or mothball them, whatever, could he put his hand up and say, look, this is a win? The U.S. is not needed anymore as much in the Middle East because of this deal that he's made.
You know, as we saw in Trump's statements about Netanyahu and his role in maintaining Netanyahu and Israel's security, President Trump is famously transactional. And if he views that these bases cost more than their worth, then of course he will reassess. But I think even for someone as transactional as Trump, the bases, the U.S. military bases, are based on an entire bureaucratic infrastructure in the United States, an entire military infrastructure, and decades of American policymaking in relation to the Middle East and particularly the Persian Gulf. And I think it would be hard for him to realign American policy in the remaining 2.5, 3 years that he has to his presidency. So I think the bases are going to stay, but I do think what we're likely to see is a diversification of strategic agreements on the part of the Gulf states with countries like Pakistan, Turkey, South Korea, and elsewhere, and also the development of a domestic military industrial infrastructure that would enable them to build more of their weapons domestically.
Ali, Iran fought this war obviously to defend itself, but its insistence in not coming to a different deal with the United States prior to was on maintaining some kind of nuclear program for civilian purposes. And given that you've had 3,500 people killed during this war, thousands more injured, has it been worth it, given that the final deal may require Iran to scale back its nuclear program in some way?
Every nation fights for its survival and security. Iran has been the victim, the United States and Israel the aggressor. So Iran had every right to defend itself, and it did, no matter the costs. You can't set any price for your security. And the heroic resistance Iranians showed is why Iran has been elevated. Iran has emerged victorious from this war by the world's biggest.
But you think 3,500 lives is worth the cost of keeping the nuclear program intact?
Iranians sacrificed their blood to defend their own country. The nuclear program is Iran's inalienable right under international law, under the NPT. Iran will not give it up. Even right now, as we speak, what Trump says about Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium is Trump's wish list. Iran will never give it up. This is a potent instrument in Iran's hands. Personally, I have been a supporter of Iran building nuclear weapons. If Iran had built the bomb, the Americans and the Israelis would have never dared to attack Iran. But Iran pursued, nuclear capability without building the bomb.
Yeah.
Iran could have been bombed without possessing any nuclear capability. So the problem is not Iran's nuclear capability. The problem is the U.S. and Israeli regional security order aimed at undermining Iran and controlling Iran's energy.
Okay. All right. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We appreciate the discussion and you all being here. Our thanks once again to our guests, Ali Akbar, Dareini, Roxane, Farmanfarmaian, and Mehran, Kamrava. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Scott McLean, and the entire team here in Doha. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay tuned.